Until I was 16, I lived in the middle of nowhere in rural Arkansas. There were nothing but fields for miles on each end, save for the highway that was about 2 miles south from my location. To the west, which faced the front of my home, was a large patch of woods. Other than that, there was a long road that ran to the house and connected to another road a few miles away. For the most part, living in the middle of nowhere is quite serene. No one to bother you, and you're free to do what you want. However, around the age of 13, I began to dislike living there. From as young as 8, I would hear strange noises at night. Mainly it was the sound of a car door slamming shut, and it would repeat. I would just keep hearing the most vague sound of a car door shutting. As I grew older, the sounds turned into strange thumps and other various sounds. Now I know that it could easily be a wild animal outside, as it was common, considering we threw our leftover food out. But there were nights when it was something else, something inhuman almost. I can remember my first definite encounter with something paranormal. I was 12 years old at the time, and it was about 2 a.m. I was pulling an all-nighter, watching TV and playing video games. While I was in the middle of playing a game, Driver I think, the power went out. Now most kids would probably flip their shit at this, but this was common for me. Many of the rural power poles and lines are quite old, some have been there for over 40 years. It was windy outside, so I imagined that a line got knocked loose. It would come back on soon, and if it didn't, we could call the power company tomorrow. Anyway, I sat there in the dark, reading a book. I decided to look outside and see how bad the trees were blowing. I looked outside, towards the woods, and saw something strange. I saw small white lights, slowly travelling along the edge of the woods. At first I figured they could have been raccoon hunters or something, but I noticed that they were moving awfully fast for them to be human. There were about 5 of them. They all moved from east to west, keeping an equal distance apart from each other. Suddenly, they all met up together. Slowly, they began to lift upon each other and connect, forming a vertical white line of light. It sat there for maybe a minute and a half before just completely disappearing. I was amazed. I never told my mum about it, as she wouldn't have believed me. I told myself that it was just hunters, or my imagination. Let's fast forward about a month later. The incident with the lights had been forgotten. It was a Tuesday night about 1 a.m, and I couldn't sleep, so I stayed up and watched television. All of a sudden, I heard a loud thump against the outside wall. I assumed that it was a possum or raccoon trying to climb the wall or some shit, so I went into the other room and grabbed the .22 rifle. I opened the front door and poked my head out to the outside wall of the house. There was nothing. I stepped outside and scanned around the front yard for a bit, but didn't see anything. I figured he had escaped and I would get him another time. I turned around and took a glimpse at the fields to the west of the house in front of the woods, and that's when I saw perhaps the scariest thing in my young life. In the dim light of the moon, I saw maybe a dozen of black figures just standing in the field. I would say that they were approximately 50 yards away. They were scattered within about a 50-foot diameter in random places. They just stood there, and judging by the shape of the silhouettes, looking directly at me. Naturally, I flipped my shit and ran inside. I woke my mum up and told her what had happened. Pissed off from being awoken for such a ridiculous reason, she stormed to the front door with me and opened it without hesitation. They were still there, except they had advanced by maybe 50 feet from the time I had first seen them. I noticed that some of the ones up front had become slightly visible by the security light we had at the edge of our property. I noticed something horrible, that their skin was completely black, a dark, rotten black, dried up and shrivelly looking. I noticed that their eyes glowed with a dull, yellow colour. My mum and I ran inside. We bolted the door and called the sheriff's department. After the longest 30 minutes, they arrived with 2 patrol cars. We heard a knock on the door and my mother hesitantly opened it. The officer stated that they searched around the property and shined the spotlights on the field, but they didn't find anything. He said that maybe it was just kids, but we knew what we had seen. The next day, me and my mum walked out into the field where we had seen those things. The fields were bare and still slightly muddy from the rain a few days ago. We found multiple sets of bare footprints in the mud in different spots. However, there were two disturbing things that we noticed about them. 1. There were no prints leading up to the footprints that we found. They were just there. No entrance, no exit. 2. Some of the toes were abnormally long or short in various places. We noticed one set that we think had 6 toes on each foot. The feet shapes were also crooked. We were unable to determine what had made them. I was quite frightened by the incident and my mum offered to let us move, but I decided to stay. This was home. For the next few years everything was normal again, until I was 16. It was just a normal sunny day. I was outside playing basketball in the driveway. I was the only one home, my mum gone to the city to get groceries. As I was shooting hoops, I began to hear an engine. I turned around thinking Mum had returned. Instead, I saw a Model T truck slowly driving down the dirt-filled road that was across the field next to my house. I stared at it. At first I figured it was just someone test driving a restored Model T, but however, upon further inspection I noticed that it was sunken into the ground like a glitched video game character or something. The wheels were about halfway in the ground, yet the vehicle just kept on moving. I noticed that it was quite rusty in some spots. In the back of it was farm equipment, old ploughing blades, and a rag sack with something in it, seed I'm guessing. I looked at the driver's seat. In horror, I saw that it was a solid black figure, just like the one I had seen that night when I was 12. I couldn't move. I just stood there in shock as it drove on, and it eventually just disappeared into thin air, driver included. I ran over to where it had driven by. No tire tracks, nothing. When my mum got home, I explained what had happened to me. After the incident with the men in the field, she had no problem in believing me. This time we made the decision to move. We ended up moving to the city. Thankfully, we have never had any encounters like that again. We sold the old land to a farmer. We haven't heard of anything scary since. 22 now.